Hello, everyone. Last month, the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub hosted a webinar featuring Dr. Emma Katz and Catherine Lawler on understanding coercive control against children, impacts, and supportive responses. Over 1,200 participants joined the webinar, and we received more questions than we had time to present during that webinar. We've invited Dr. Katz and Catherine Lawler to join us again today to answer more of your questions. If you haven't done so already, we strongly encourage you to watch the full webinar recording, as well as this supplementary Q&A session. My colleague Annalise Stratman and I will present your questions, and we'll start off and position this Q&A session by inviting Dr. Emma Katz to provide us with a brief description of what is meant by coercive control.
So coercive control involves situations where somebody is subjecting another person or persons to persistent and wide-ranging controlling behavior over a long period of time, and they're making it clear that standing up for themselves will be punished. So the controlling person is setting up this dynamic of do what I say or else. And by repeatedly punishing the person they're controlling for non-compliance, the controller, the abuser, is intending to demoralize and terrorize that person into a state of permanent obedience. And this isn't about passion or lost tempers. This is about the coercive controller believing they are entitled to control others in ways that strip them of their normal rights and liberties. And what we see in victims and survivors of this is that they are walking on eggshells the whole time, self-policing their own behaviors to try and avoid being punished by the perpetrator. And that punishment might be violence, but it might be something else that they really dread, like being called a whole barrage of nasty names, or some form of economic abuse or sexual abuse against them. So they're trying to stop that from happening, trying to avoid punishment, trying to stay in line with what the perpetrator wants. The perpetrator's probably convinced them that it's all their fault. And what we see in victims and survivors of this is that they're just not able to exercise self-determination over their lives. So things like that we would normally take for granted, where they can go, how long they can spend there, who they can talk to, how they can dress, what opinions they can express, how they can use space within the home, just all the things that we would normally take for granted as free persons. Victims and survivors who are being coercively controlled can't do those things because the perpetrator, if they step out of line, the perpetrator is going to punish them. And the perpetrator is very aware that they're creating this dynamic, and it's a very purposeful and deliberate strategy.
Oh, thank you. That positions the rest of our discussion. And just wondering, could you describe some of the ways that technology might be used to facilitate coercive control against parents and children?
Yes, so in this increasingly technological world, there's so many different technological advances and devices that somebody looking to control another person can now use. So we see perpetrators using devices that allow them to monitor and stalk the person who they're trying to control, whether that's their partner, their ex-partner, or even their child. So, for example, we've seen perpetrators putting malware on phones, laptops, so that they're duplicated on the perpetrator's device, and then they see every single keystroke that's typed. We see them abusing things like Apple AirTags and slipping them even into the soles of children's shoes and surreptitiously getting them back into their ex-partner's home so they can then monitor exactly where they're going. We see them hacking the smart devices that people are now using to monitor the electricity in their home security systems. So nowadays you can instruct your home to turn on the central heating a few minutes before you get back. They're hacking into those devices so that they're becoming spyware. They're putting hidden cameras that are increasingly tiny in all sorts of places. So you name it, a perpetrator will find a way to misuse it, and very often using the children as a way of doing that as well. Like I say, slipping surveillance devices into the children's things post separation during contact time, so then they can spy permanently on their ex-partner without them knowing about it. So it's a really insidious form of abuse, and survivors are often either unaware it's happening, or they've got a hunch it's happening but they're not quite sure what to do about it, or they know it's happening and they're trying to tell people and people think that they're just being paranoid. So it's, at the moment, I think it's really difficult for survivors to get a good response from people. And also it's I think it's difficult to hold perpetrators to account for all those behaviors, because perhaps we haven't quite caught up with the reality of the way that they're using technology these days to monitor, control, and spy.
Thank you.
Catherine, this question is for you. Can you talk about, we often talk about children's resilience, but we don't often discuss their resistance. Can you speak to this? In what ways have you seen children resist coercive control?
So if I can start, is it okay to start to look at what resilience is, just to remind ourselves of that before we sort of look at sort of resistance? So I suppose resilience is, we tend to understand it as a way that we bounce back or cope with difficult things or adversity. And actually, children can sometimes resist by being resilient. So if we look at the key components for resilience, and that could take another hour, so I'll do a shortcut around that. So some things that spring to mind are good experiences in school, sort of doing well in school, certainly having one grown up that will fight your corner or be there for you, whether that be a mother, another family member, a member of the community, having a pro-social peer group, the ability to have fun when things are really, really difficult, and to use humour. So I suppose if I was having a dialogue with a child or trying to assess their resilience or their resistance, what I'd look at is what the risk factors, what I thought the risk factors were for them currently, and then the protective factors. And then what I'd do in child-friendly language, depending on the age of the child. And when people go back and watch the webinar, we talked about not using denial statements, so making light of things or trying to make out that everything is okay when it doesn't feel okay to children. So using appropriate language, I'd look at their day-to-day activity, and they might do well in school as a coping mechanism, and that might be a way that they are resisting, that I'm going to enjoy my school and I'm going to do well. They may be able, sometimes they're not, spend time with their peer group and have fun with them, and do lots of nice things with them. And that is another way of sort of resisting. So what I'd do is I'd look at what resilience is and what a child is actually doing, and that actually might form part of their resistance. Their coping strategies might form part of their resistance, yeah? And I've made a few sort of notes about resilient and resistant language that you could use maybe with children. So you gave it a go, you tried something, you did your best, you're working towards a goal. If they've developed a new skill, you've learned this, you've developed that. If you're talking about sort of safety strategies or safety planning with them, oh, you remembered that and you did that, despite everything that's going on in your life. So I think when we look at resilience, we can look at that dual conversation. Other areas of resistance might put children in danger. So it might be if there is an assault or a continuum of behaviour that links into that coercive control narrative, that a child, and I very much did this as a child, would stand in front of my mother and argue with the perpetrator. Or if there was a violent assault, I would jump in to protect my mother. And it's really easy sometimes to tell children not to do that, and we need to tell them not to do that. But as a child living in that, it's incredibly difficult for some children not to do that because you want to protect your mum or your siblings or your family members. So I think there are different ways that children can resist. Some that may put them in physical harm, and others may be the extraordinary way that some children can carry on with their normal day-to-day activities and get some pleasure from it. So I hope that sort of answers that question.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, they found a way to maybe put themselves in a bit of a bubble and cushion themselves and protect themselves so that they don't have to kind of continue to experience it so openly and blatantly.
Yeah. Or they may not even realise that they're doing that.
Yeah.
And a positive conversation would be, hey, do you know what? I've noticed this. And actually, that's really good considering, you know, so those sorts of positive narratives you can have with children.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Katz. So Catherine talked a little bit about risk factors, and this question is going to speak a little bit about risk factors and risk assessment tools as well, particularly when we think about measuring or assessing risk for lethality and as it relates to coercive control. Are you aware of any research that identifies the number of or which coercive control factors need to be present to indicate risk for lethality? Is it something like 5 out of 15 risk factors must be present? Like when you think of something like the danger assessment tool or other lethality risk assessment tools? Or is it something like if he's obsessive and jealous and has access to a firearm, does it equal high lethality? Are you aware of any risk assessment tools that address these concerns or the risk factors that we should be paying more attention to?
In the UK, where Catherine and myself are based, there's been some particularly helpful research around lethality in the last couple of years by Professor Jane Monckton-Smith. And she's developed a domestic homicide timeline and also a domestic abuse suicide related timeline. And with these timelines, she's able to and the research that she's done around them to develop them, she's identified 8 stages that will occur in the run up to the vast majority of cases where a perpetrator is committing a homicide, a femicide, a filicide against their partner, children. So I would definitely recommend having a read of Professor Jane Monckton-Smith's work on this. She has an absolutely excellent book about this, and the book's called In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder. But what I would just say right now is that what she identifies is that markers like separation and escalation in control better identify the potential for imminent homicide. And she also notes that where there is control, violence, even low-level violence, and a separation after people have lived together. So people have lived together, there's been control, there's been violence, whether it's low level or higher level, that doesn't really matter, but there's been control, and then the control seems to be escalating. In those cases, there is a 900% increase in the potential for homicide. So we need to be very aware that is the case. And the reasons that men tend to give for killing their partners overwhelmingly revolve around their perceiving that their partner is withdrawing their commitment and their unwillingness to allow that to happen, or their perception or an actual separation. So it may be that their partner is planning to escape them, or it may be that they just perceive that their partner is planning to escape, even though they might not be really, but they've come to the conclusion that they are. So the separation, real or imagined, real or impending, is a real trigger for perpetrators, because it's all about being in control for them. And if you're about to break their control, or you have recently broken it, then there's a huge risk for intimate partner homicide, femicide, and also filicide, the killing of the children in those situations, because that's the ultimate act for the perpetrator of taking back their control over you. We so often, particularly in the media, we get this wrong, and we think that perpetrators who kill in these circumstances have just snapped, they've seen the red mist, they've done something impulsive. And what Professor Jane Monckton-Smith often finds is that there was actually a great deal of planning in these homicides, and that they haven't just snapped, they're the culmination of years of coercive control. And in the perpetrator's mind, killing is a way of regaining control and regaining a sense of status that they feel has been diminished by your threatening of their control, by attempting to break free of it. So yeah, in summary, I would say look out for relationships where there's been control, there's been some violence, albeit it could be low level, such as pushing, shoving, slapping. It doesn't necessarily have to be being beaten black and blue. And then the control seems to be escalating, and the perpetrator seems to be thinking that there's going to be a separation, and there might indeed actually be a separation, because that time around separation is the most dangerous time.
Thank you so very much.
Can I just come in there just about risk assessment, if that's okay? So the danger statement the danger assessment that you're talking about, the equivalent we have in Britain is the DASH, the Domestic Abuse Stalking a Risk Assessment Checklist. It's a very similar tool. And I'm going to be really naughty now and move on to older people just for a second, if you will indulge me. So what I tend to find when I look at the some of the risk assessments, especially the DASH in the UK, it's very geared to younger women. And as domestic abuse and coercive control continues within that sort of timeline, so my mum died in that type of setting, and her second marriage was 43 years. She would have scored really low on the current risk assessment. And actually, she was really high risk. So I know we're talking about children and their mothers today, but just to shout out for older women, what we're looking to do in my workplace with a group of older ladies who are survivors is rewrite that tool, because what we tend to miss within domestic abuse is the older cohort of people. They don't show up in our system. And what we do know is domestic abuse does not stop because people get older. It may change slightly, and in fact, there will probably be more coercive control than physical violence and rape at that point. So just a shout out for the older generation of ladies there. I think we need to keep them in mind.
And Catherine, what we've learned in our work, and I'm sure you have in yours, is that there may not be children, but there will be grandchildren that may also be being exposed or experiencing that continuing abuse and coercive control. So absolutely relevant, even when we're talking about children.
Thank you for indulging me.
The next question we'd like to pose to both of you, and we'd like to start with you, Catherine, and then move to Emma Katz, but the same question. And in some situations, what service providers have observed is that when a mother has been coercively controlled by her partner, sometimes she then exhibits coercively controlling behavior towards a child or her children. And so in those situations, we have a victim survivor that we definitely want to support, as in the adult, the mother. But we're also concerned about some of the behaviors demonstrating toward the child, both by the abusive partner, in the sense of, if I can use primary abuser in terms of the adult situation, but also what may be happening secondarily to that child in terms of their relationship from the parent that has been victimized by coercive control. And we just wondered if you can comment on that situation and also recommend supportive strategies for supporting both the mother and child, which I know both of you always want to do and what we're concerned about.
Yeah, and I again have personal experience of that with my mum and my brother. So I think on a personal level, and again, I think it's possibly under-researched, what ladies may be doing is using the survival strategies that they have used to keep them and their children safe from the perpetrator. And for some reason, they then spill over into that sort of relationship with their child. So with my mum, and again, this is very personal, she did, I wouldn't say coercively control, but she infantilized my brother. And the reason she did that is she didn't want him to leave home, because I left very early at 16. She wanted him to reside with her as an adult to still be a barrier of protection from her second husband, who was his father, which he was. The problem with that is when she passed away, he had no life skills, because in a sense she infantilized him and did everything for him. And that's the only argument me and my mum, before she passed away, continually had. And what I tried to do for her was to get her to understand that some of the strategies and the tactics that she'd used for a very long time, so they become second nature for her, were spilling over into her parenting skills of a young child and then an adult child, if that makes sense. I think it's very difficult. I think it's very complex. I think it depends if the lady is still living with the perpetrator or not. But I think primarily the conversation would be getting somebody to really analyse what they've done to keep themselves and their children safe, and see if there is any correlation with their current parenting style, and do that in a non-judgmental, non-victim blaming way, you know, an explorative and a supportive way. It is very, very difficult. And there are occasions where that does happen, and it can affect relationships and extra sibling relationships. And when my mum passed away, as well as grieving, the first thing that came into my mind was, I'm going to be the parent of a 40-year-old man. And that really is still happening. Yeah. So I think it's about those coping strategies spilling over, and very kind, exploring about why that's happening. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Dr. Katz, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so the best thing that I've ever read about women who are behaving somewhat abusively towards their children in a context where they themselves are being subjected to coercive control and intimate partner violence and abuse is actually a Canadian article called Women's Abuse of Their Children in the Context of Domestic Violence, Reflections from Women's Accounts. And I found that article very useful and very sensitively written, as Catherine said, and very non-victim blaming. And I thought it had tackled it very well. And just the highlights from this article. So they point out that being victimized does not remove all responsibility, but it does place the victim's actions and choices in a particular, very constrained context. And they note that some of their participants, who were women who had used abuse against their children in situations where they themselves were being abused by male partners, that some of the women had talked about the difficulties involved in mothering in this context, and that fear and exhaustion had led to the adoption of abusive behaviours towards children in some cases. They were absolutely exhausted, they were fearful, and their emotions were very reactive. They weren't in a calm state at all. How could they be in that circumstance? The authors noted that the difficulties that abused women face in relation to their mothering are due to the particular context created by their partner's violence, but also the fact that this context is at odds with the very high expectations that are placed on mothers. You know, we often put so much pressure on mothers to be the primary carer of the children, that to be the one who knows everything about the children, does everything to make them safe and happy. We don't tend to place those expectations on fathers to anywhere near the same extent. So some women talked about feeling under extra pressure because of that, and that was also contributing to their kind of despair and their feeling of being somewhat out of control in their own behavior, because it was like the high standard they were meant to achieve was so high that it just felt completely unachievable, and that was causing them distress. And then it was also noted that that being controlling with the children could be a way of trying to protect them from worse punishment from the abuser. So very often the abuser won't tolerate the children shouting, making noise, making mess, being in certain parts of the house at certain times, and that the abuser, the father or the stepfather, will severely punish the children if he becomes displeased with them, because his extremely rigid and unreasonable rules are not being followed by these little children. So the mother may end up having to be very controlling and harsh with the children because she thinks it's the only way to protect them from even worse punishment from the father, should the father want to behave in those ways towards the children. And also it might be the mother might be behaving in this way towards the children, who of course she has a bit of power over as their parent, in a situation where she's been massively disempowered by her abuser. So it might be an outlet where she can exert some power, because her normal power that a normal adult would have has been completely stripped away from her. So these are kind of the contexts in which this might take place. And the authors did note that they thought that there was a good chance that if the domestic violence was able to stop, if the abuser was held accountable, if the mother was able to be safe, which obviously is not easy, and the mother requires a great deal of assistance, and professionals need to really look at how they put curbs on the abuser's ability to carry on. But they did notice that that mothers described, at least in their sample, that their behavior had really changed towards their children, and had really, the abusive behavior towards the children had really come to an end once they had achieved safety and stability, and they were in a place where they weren't being abused. I don't think that would happen all the time, but I think in many cases it would improve when they were no longer being abused. And that article also noted that these mothers could feel very guilty for their behavior towards the children. They could feel that they were being blamed if it was raised with them. And if you feel guilty and you feel like you're going to be judged, you can be very touchy about anyone saying anything to you. So as Catherine said, these conversations need to be broached so carefully, so gently, in a very exploratory way, so that it's possible for mothers to engage in them without this, like, having really high defense mechanisms up because they think they're about to be really badly judged. Remember, they never asked a mother in these circumstances. They thought they were getting into a good relationship. The abuser tricked them, manipulated them, and entrapped them. And also remember that they probably already think of themselves as being the most terrible mothers. So it's important not to reinforce that, and to try and look at the ways that they try to support their children, as well as the times that they weren't behaving so well towards their children, and to recognize the whole picture. Now, having said all of that, I think this article is really geared around women who would not normally behave abusively towards children, but were doing so because of the extreme circumstances the perpetrator was creating. And I think that's what we are looking at most of the time. But I do think there are also some women who would have always abused their children, even if their partner was completely non-abusive himself, because of because of their own profile and their own beliefs and their own attitudes towards children, and their kind of their own package of issues. And I think that's a separate issue from what I was just talking about with this article. And I think it's just important to bear that in mind as well, because in some cases, I think they would have always behaved that way, even if the abuser had not ever been abusive towards them. So that is, I think, slightly separate from cases where women are behaving that way because of the extreme pressure the abuser's putting on them, but ordinarily they never would have behaved that way.
Okay, thank you. Wanted just briefly, wondered if you would speak to, and I'm going to ask Catherine to start us off with this one. Some of our participants in the webinar observed that coercive control sometimes is exercised at a systems level. So systems that are actually there to support children and families are actually coercively controlling them. And the comment was, we need to be holding system players accountable for causing this harm, don't we? So the question. So yeah.
How long have you got?
You know,
So I'll try and keep it brief.
Okay, it's such an important question though, and we know that potentially that's in terms of that system level coercive control, it's differentially affecting different mothers and children, different groups of mothers and children, and just wanted to hear you comment about perhaps holding systems accountable.
Well, I think here in the UK we need a whole systems change. A whole system changed approach. What we've currently got, and I'll just allude to a few, so because I know Emma, I'll leave Emma to speak about the family courts. Maybe Emma, I'll speak about children's social care. So we have these double binds and double standards for women. So as Emma's just said, women are usually the primary carers, or the focus of services will be on women, not men. It will be on the victim survivor, not the perpetrator. And there's double binds and double standards all the way through those systems. So if you think about the term intersectionality, I know it was originally a feminist term to look at the different barriers for women. If we think about intersectionality and women in systems and domestic abuse, the barriers are, they're just building up like a brick wall. So for example, within social care, social services, it is not unheard of at that statutory level where there are worries about the safeguarding of the children for mothers to be told to manage the risk of the perpetrator, when even, the services, the police and the other services around there, can't manage that risk. She is held accountable for the perpetrator's behaviour, not stopping the perpetrator's behaviour. There is very little exploration in how daily she is protecting and risk assessing and protecting herself and her children. It very much feels like a blame culture. So you'll get the double bind statements like, if your partner continues to behave like this and your children are at risk, they will be removed from your care, which must be terrifying. And then what you'll probably naturally get is women thinking, I'm not going to phone the police anymore when this thing happens because I've got risk of, if they know that it's going on, my children will be removed. And then they are labelled as uncooperative or secretive. All these labels get thrown on them. And going back to what Emma's just was saying before about mothers probably feeling they're the worst mums in the world, the shame that they'll hold on their own shoulders will be like a pair of dumbbells, and the services just add to that shame. So then mothers may have their children removed, and then all of a sudden it's fine for perpetrators to have unsupervised contact or different types of contact with his children. So the narrative does not make sense, and it's completely victim blaming. The expectation on mothers is so high, certainly within the statutory services. It just needs rewriting. We don't understand it properly, I don't feel, and we don't deal with it properly. And that's from statutory services. And as I say, I'll let Emma speak about family courts, then sort of going into the family court. So I would completely agree that the systems around the victim survivor need rewriting. And when we think about if women do phone the police, sometimes the response is poor. The criminal justice response is poor. So there is just double binds, barriers. And for me, that's why originally I came out of statutory services as a worker and went into the voluntary section, because I was really fatigued and traumatized with seeing women constantly blamed for perpetrators' behaviour and responsible for managing a risk that is unmanageable. So I agree with that comment, and I'll leave the family court stuff for Emma.
Absolutely, and I think you outlined that so well. I think that the systems are set up on entirely the wrong assumptions. So the systems are set up based on the idea that the domestic abuse is incidents of violence. And the incidents of violence start at a certain time and stop at a certain time, as in the domestic abuse happened on a Tuesday between 7 and 7:30 p.m. And then we assume that the perpetrator is not dangerous the rest of the time. And we assume that the victim has complete freedom of choice the rest of the time. And that is so incredibly wrong, because with controlling abusers, they will be controlling the whole time using multiple tactics. They're psychologically abusing and manipulating the victim the whole time. They are economically abusing the victim, preventing them from building up the financial independence that they would need to break free. They are probably being sexually coercive with the victim a lot of the time. They are monitoring the victim, stalking them, controlling, micro-regulating and micro-policing what they can and cannot do each day. And of course, they're isolating them all the time as well. So, you know, there will always be these rules around who you can see and how long you can spend there, and, you know, what isn't okay in terms of you seeing other people. So the whole victim's life, the whole time, will be very, very small. It will have shrunk right down to a tiny little space. And that victim might still be going to work, and their colleagues might not notice what's the matter because they put up a very good front at work, but their freedom outside of that will be very limited. The perpetrator's probably monitoring how long they take to get from the house to work, perhaps taking them there themselves in a car, not allowing them to go by themselves, or if they are allowed to go by themselves, they're tracked, they're monitored, they're stalked to make sure they're not having an affair or speaking to a friend on the way, because abusers often use paranoia around that as a reason to control. So anyway, we get back to systems, and the systems are assuming that none of that is happening, and that when victims are behaving the ways that they are, it's because they're making lifestyle choices that are poor, that they're behaving erratically, that they're being, as Catherine said, non-cooperative, secretive. But none of that is actually the case. They are responding to the perpetrator's constant abuse of them, and they are trying to survive that all the time. And the victim and survivor will know very well that the world does not really understand what they're going through, and that they are really on their own. And so they will be doing their best to risk assess every situation, and all of their behaviors will make sense if you actually recognize them in the context of what is actually going on. But services aren't recognizing what's actually going on, so we end up with ridiculous statements like, you know, you allow to the mother, you allow the children to witness the domestic violence. Well, what was the mother supposed to say? You know, excuse me, darling, can you just stop beating me in the living room? Can we just go in the kitchen, then you can carry on beating me? Of course she can't say that. That's completely preposterous. She has no power in that circumstance. If the children are exposed to violence, it's because the perpetrator chose to be violent in a way that exposed the children to violence, and the victim of that violence had no choice about how that violence took place or not. So, and again, our systems are often based on the idea that the victim is provoking the perpetrator, you know, by nagging or wearing the wrong thing or being insufficiently respectful to their husband. Again, all of this is nonsense. The perpetrator who's controlling, they are using any excuse to exert control, and they are hell bent on maintaining that control. And it doesn't matter whether the victim, you know, lives like a virtual nun or what the victim does. You know, the perpetrator will still find excuses to control them, to tell them that they're doing everything wrong, to tell them that they need to be different. It's not the victim causing this at all, it's the perpetrator. And when you do get everything right, the perpetrator then moves the goalposts, so you're suddenly getting everything wrong again. So for victims, they're not provoking the perpetrator, and they have no control over the perpetrator's choices to behave in this very, very abusive way. And then, as Catherine said, mothers are often told by statutory services like child protection, this man is so dangerous and so violent that if you don't separate from him and take your children with you, and if you don't shut the door in his face, then your children will have to be removed from you, because this man is so violent and so dangerous. And if the mother, heaven forbid, he turns up banging on the door, and she calculates that the safest thing to do is to let him in rather than let him work up to such an angry pitch that he kicks the door down, heaven forbid she does that, because then she'll be blamed for letting him in. And then 6 months later, they're in family court because the perpetrator has taken her to family court. And in family court, the narrative is, he's a perfectly adequate father. The children are absolutely fine in his care. If he has beaten them in the past, that's in the past. If he sexually abused other children, well, he did that to other children, but he's not a risk to his own children. If he sexually abused his own children, well, he says he's sorry about that, and maybe it wasn't that serious anyway. And if the mother's saying that he's dangerous, that the children are petrified of him, she's an alienating mother, she's a hysterical mother, she's an unfriendly parent, she's hostile, she's uncooperative, she's high conflict, and every possible label you can imagine there. And then the mother is either forced into co-parenting with a man who quite probably, you know, was certainly abused her, quite probably raped her, has quite a high likelihood of having physically abused the children, certainly psychologically abused them. She then has to co-parent with him to some extent, and in some cases she actually loses custody to him, and he gets the children full time. And in more cases than people probably are aware of. And so this is just the most dire set of circumstances, and not all mothers do end up in family court, because not all perpetrators take them to family court. But where it does go to family court, the outcomes for abused women and children are not good at the moment at all. In the UK, less than 2% of family court cases result in an order of no contact. And yet we think that over 60% of the cases in the family court are domestic abuse cases. That's probably an underestimate, because women are told all the time to not even mention domestic abuse to the courts, lest they be seen as an alienating, hostile, vindictive mother. So the 60% is probably an underestimate, but less than 2% of these cases are resulting in an order of no contact, because the culture of family courts is so overwhelmingly pro-contact. You know, the idea is that there is nothing worse than saying no contact, and it's better to send the children off to be abused by their father than to say no to that father. So there's so many issues with the systems, and poor survivors are left absolutely in despair. They've experienced what is called institutional betrayal. They thought that services that were going to protect them very often haven't protected them, and have even made things worse. So going back to the questioner's question, yes, we need systems change so much.
And can I just come in with one last one on that? The amount of women that have come. We have a system in Britain called MARAC, Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, and that is around high-risk victims. The amount that could potentially be murdered, and the amount of females I've seen wrongly labelled and coming through that system as perpetrators in what we would call self-defence or violent resistance, so that, you know, in America, again, it is shocking. So someone trying to defend themselves, trying to defend their children, injure a partner, and then are in the criminal justice system or labelled as a perpetrator. And there's far too much of that going on as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
So, Catherine, what would you recommend to intervene and support a child who appears to be reenacting the behaviors of the abusive and controlling parent towards the victim, survivor, or the siblings? So we've talked a little bit about how, you know, the mothers might be using some coercive control on the children and or the other abusive parent. But what about when it goes the other way around?
So the first thing I'd just like to remind people of, if they were on the original webinar, was the roles that children can play in families. And two of those roles can be the father or the perpetrator's confidant, or the father, stepfather, perpetrator's abuser. So I think what we need to do is look at which roles children were assigned to by the perpetrator in that family first and foremost. These type of roles and these type of behaviours will, there will be a high level of trauma connected to the children that are hurting their mums. Children don't want to hurt their mums. I've worked with lots of children that have hurt their mums, that have ended up in children's mental health services because the trauma and the confusion, and actually the self-revulsion that they feel for doing that is overwhelming. And the root to that is the perpetrator, and usually the roles that children play. I think it's important to work out that once families maybe leave and get into a safer setting, Some children don't know how to react once that fear and terror is gone. And as some mothers don't, it's a completely alien situation for them. It's something that their little brains and bodies, or big brains and bodies of the teenagers, have have learned to cope with. We talked about talking to children about the fight flight response and using a brain as a superpower. And if that is your daily existence, if that is how you live because you have to live, it is very difficult to get into another zone where those behaviours are not used. Adolescent or child to parent violence is pretty under researched, sort of, in this country. There is a book, and I won't try and show it on the screen because it went weird before, but I'll read it out. It's Child to Parent Violence and Abuse, a Practitioner's Guide to Working with Families, and it's by Helen Bonnick. Now, Helen Bonnick is, as Emma is, sort of the academic in coercive control. Helen Bonnick is the academic in adolescent to child child to parent violence. So I recommend you get that book, and I will send you a link to her website. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but in some parts of Britain, because domestic abuse services are ridiculously patchy. And considering the amount domestic abuse costs the economy, I think we discussed this last time, it's ridiculous that it's so underfunded. But in Great Britain, there are certain services that do run groups for children who are hurting their mums, that have lived in the context of domestic abuse. And they will include groups for mums, groups for children, and then a group with mum and children. So that triad, which I think is really important within services. The services need to talk together. We can't work with children and mums in isolation. There is a time where we need to bring that sort of narrative together. So you may have those services in Canada. If you haven't, it would be great to get them up and running. But it's very, very much underfunded. So look at what services you've got. And I think it's the roles that children play. And it's going back to what we were saying about mums who may be controlling. It's very gently, and this will take time, very gently unpicking the child's lived experience, all the variables around that, the mum's lived experience, and current lived experience of a child is hurting her, and all the variables about that. But then thinking about that attachment stuff, that's not difficult to do. What can we do? Are there activities that children and their mothers can do together that are fun, that they can make their own memories, their own positive memories? So for me, it's very much about bringing that attachment stuff sort of back in and having those narratives. I once worked with a little boy who hated his mother. That was his words. And he did hit his mother. And when we did some work around their experience of when they lived with domestic abuse, one thing was at the forefront of his mind. And it was the perpetrating stepfather used to make very large meals, and this child had to eat them all. And he was usually nearly sick, and then he had to eat his sick. And a mother had to watch it. Yeah, so an absolute torturous way of controlling a family. And if mother would have intervened, they all would have been assaulted. Yeah. So what mother used to do was eat some of that food when perpetrator had nipped out, or throw it over a fence. So in her way, she was protecting her child. In his mind, that shouldn't have happened anywhere, mummy. That shouldn't have happened anywhere. But once we were able to get a narrative about mum's protective factors going in, but completely validated this little boy's feelings and how he perceived that situation, and then got them into lots of clubs and activities, slowly but surely, that relationship started to repair itself and got back on track. But it did take time.
What a wonderful way to end this wonderful discussion. We are out of time. I want to remind everybody, please go back and listen to the full recording of the webinar that Dr. Katz and Catherine presented for us on November 22nd. And please enjoy this. It is worthwhile as a standalone, but I think it'll be richer when it's combined with the original webinar. So with that, we want to thank everybody. Annalie and I and the team want to thank everybody for being part of this, and especially to you, Catherine Lawler, and to you, Dr. Emma Katz, for so kindly making time to join us again to answer more of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub subscribers' questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.